The road into Harlan's Bluff was the kind that discouraged visitors. It wound up through pine forest so thick the sun gave up trying somewhere around the 3,000-foot mark, and the asphalt had cracked and heaved so many times over the decades that driving it felt less like transportation and more like a negotiation. Most people who ended up there had either made a wrong turn or had run out of better options. Elias Cutter had run out of better options 11 years ago, and now he could not imagine living anywhere else. He was a large man, Elias, in the way that mountains are large, not aggressive about it, just undeniably present. 6'4" in his boots, with hands that looked like they belonged on a creature twice his size, and a beard that had gone from dark brown to something closer to iron gray over the past few years. Without him paying it much attention, he ran a small lumber operation on his own land, 40 acres of managed forest that he harvested responsibly and replanted every spring. He kept 3 dogs, Bear, Marcy, and a one-eyed shepherd mix he called Ghost, and he grew most of his own vegetables in a garden behind his cabin that had started modest and expanded every year because it turned out he had a talent for making things grow. He was not, by any stretch, a sociable man. He drove into town every 2 weeks for supplies he could not make or grow himself, and he ate at Patty's diner on those trips because Patty Gruber made a beef stew that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, and because sitting in a warm room full of other human beings for an hour every 2 weeks seemed like the minimum effort required to remain technically part of civilization. He sat at the same corner booth each time, ordered the same stew, drank 2 cups of coffee, left a generous tip, and went home. The people of Harlan's Bluff had learned to let him be. They nodded when he came in. Patty always had his booth ready, and the general understanding was that Elias Cutter was a good man who preferred his own company, and that was a perfectly acceptable way to be. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed. The leaves had mostly fallen by then, leaving the mountains with that stripped, honest look they got in autumn, all bone and bark and pale sky. Elias had driven in for his supplies earlier than usual because a storm was forecast for the end of the week, and he wanted to make sure his firewood was stacked and his pantry was full before it arrived. He'd loaded his truck at the hardware store and the feed supply, then parked outside Patty's at 5:30, just as the early darkness was settling in. The diner was fuller than usual that evening. There was some kind of high school event in town, a game or a play. Elias neither knew nor particularly needed to know, and parents and grandparents and younger siblings were filling the booths and counter stools, creating a warm, chaotic noise that Elias found slightly overwhelming but tolerated because the stew made it worth it. He hung his coat on the hook inside the door, nodded to Patty, and made his way to his corner booth. He had been sitting for about 10 minutes, had received his stew and his first cup of coffee, and was eating in his customary peaceful silence when he heard it. The voice was small, not a child's small exactly. It wasn't high, pitched or squeaky, but small in the way that things get when they've been compressed by hunger or fear or both. It came from the booth directly beside his, separated from him by a wooden partition that came up to seated eye level. He could not see who was speaking. He could only hear the words, and the words were these: "Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother, but may we have your leftovers, when you're done, whatever you don't want?" There was a pause, and then Elias heard the family in the next booth respond. The father's voice, a little embarrassed, maybe annoyed: "We haven't ordered yet. I'll ask the waitress about you, okay, just hang on." Elias set down his spoon. He listened and heard the soft sound of small feet retreating across the linoleum, back toward the far side of the diner. He could not see from where he sat. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. He was not a man who usually deliberated. And then he stood up, picked up his bowl and his coffee, and walked around the partition. He almost missed them because they were sitting so still. In the very last booth, the one tucked against the wall beside the emergency exit, sat a girl and a boy. The girl looked to be around 9 or 10, and the boy was younger, maybe 6 or 7. They were both thin in a way that was not natural for children their age, not the lean thinness of kids who ran and played and burned energy, but the angular, hollow thinness of children who had not been eating enough. Their clothes were clean, but had the faded, worn look of things that had been washed too many times in too old water. The girl had dark hair pulled back in a braid that was coming loose, and the boy was leaning against her shoulder with his eyes half closed, exhausted. It was the girl who had asked. Elias understood that without being told. She sat up straight when she saw him approaching, and something in her face went carefully neutral. That particular expression children learn when they've gotten used to disappointing responses from adults. She was preparing herself. She had learned how to receive a no without flinching. But it was her eyes that stopped Elias Cutter where he stood, 2 feet from the booth, his stew bowl in one hand and his coffee in the other, like a man who had walked into a room and forgotten why. He had seen a lot in his years. He had been married once, briefly, in his early 30s, and it had ended badly. He had lost his father and his mother within 8 months of each other a decade ago. He had watched a friend drink himself to death slowly over 3 years and not been able to stop it. He was not an innocent man when it came to understanding what grief and hardship looked like. But the eyes of this girl, dark brown, steady, serious, old in a way that no child's eyes should be old, hit him somewhere between the sternum and the spine like a physical thing, like a hand reaching in and taking hold. She was not crying. She was not asking for pity. She was just looking at him with those ancient, careful eyes, and in them he could read something that he recognized from the worst periods of his own life, the absolute, practical acceptance of a person who has already decided they will survive whatever comes next, and who is simply waiting to find out what shape survival will take. "I heard you ask that family for leftovers," Elias said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the way it always did when he hadn't spoken much in a while. "I'm sorry," the girl said. "I shouldn't have. I know you're not supposed to bother people. You're hungry," Elias said. It wasn't a question. The girl said nothing. The boy stirred slightly against her shoulder, opened his eyes, saw a very large man standing over them, and closed his eyes again. He was too tired to be alarmed, apparently. "How long since you ate?" Elias asked. The girl considered this question carefully, with an honesty that he found remarkable. "Yesterday morning," she said. "We had crackers. There were crackers in the truck." "Where's the truck now?" "About a mile back down the mountain road. It stopped going." She said this with no drama, no tears. It stopped going, and so they walked, and so here they were. Elias set his bowl down on the table in front of her. He set his coffee beside it. He went to the counter, caught Patty's eye, Patty, who was already watching all of this with the particular attention of a woman who had seen a lot of human difficulty pass through her diner over 30 years, and said quietly, "Another bowl. Kids' menu, whatever's good, and milk. Chocolate if you've got it." He paused. "And pie, do you have pie tonight?" "Apple and pumpkin," Patty said, and her voice was careful in the way of a person trying not to make the situation larger than it needed to be at this precise moment. "Both," he said, and went back to the booth. He sat down across from the children. The girl was already eating, with a control that told him she was fighting the urge to eat faster, making herself be deliberate because she knew, from experience, that eating too fast after not eating makes you sick. The boy was watching the stew bowl with enormous eyes. Elias nudged it toward him gently. and the boy looked at his sister for permission, and she nodded, and then both of them were eating. Elias sat with his hands folded on the table and watched them and did not speak, because they did not need words right now. They needed calories, and he understood that some moments required you to simply hold still and be present. Patty brought another bowl, 2 glasses of chocolate milk, and both pies. She set them down without a word and retreated, and Elias watched the children eat, and the tight place behind his ribs that had clenched when he first saw those eyes began, very slowly, to ease. When they had slowed down, when the desperate edge had come off, and they were eating like normal children rather than like people who were afraid the food might disappear, Elias said, "What are your names?" "Nora," the girl said. "He's Sam." "Where are your parents, Nora?" The careful neutrality came back into her face, and he recognized it again as armor. "Our mom's in the hospital in Callaway," she said. "She's been there for 3 weeks. She has something wrong with her heart. They said she might be there for a while longer." She looked at the table. "We were staying with our uncle, but he said he couldn't keep us anymore. He said he was sorry, but he didn't have room, so we were going to our grandmother's house. She lives up past Harlan's Bluff. Up in the high country. We were trying to find her." "Where in the high country?" "On a road called Sutter Creek Road. Her name is Me Aldridge. She doesn't have a phone, or I would have called her." Elias was quiet for a moment. Me Aldridge. He knew the name, vaguely knew there was an old woman up on Sutter Creek who'd been there for decades, kept to herself, ordered a small food delivery from the general store every month. He'd never met her directly, but in a place like Harlan's Bluff, you knew the names even if you didn't know the people. "How old are you?" he asked Nora. 10, she said. "Sam is 6. A 10-year-old had walked a mile down a mountain road in late October darkness with her 6-year-old brother and gone into a diner and asked strangers for their leftovers with the calm composure of a much older person, because she was hungry and her brother was hungry, and she had decided as 10-year-olds who have been left to manage things alone sometimes do, that pride was a luxury and her brother's hunger was not. He thought about what it cost her to ask. He thought about what had already happened to a child to make asking strangers for leftovers feel like the reasonable, practical option. "Sutter Creek Road is about 6 miles from here," Elias said, "up a rough track. You can't walk it tonight, especially not with this cold." Nora nodded as if she had already considered this, and was waiting to hear what the alternative would be. "I'm going to call someone," he said. "Someone who can check on your mom in Callaway, make sure she's okay, make sure she knows where you are. And then I'm going to take you to your grandmother's." He paused. "Is that all right with you?" She looked at him with those old eyes for a long moment, taking his measure the way a grown person would, the way a person does when they have learned that adults do not always do what they say, when they have learned to read faces for signs of what's actually coming. He held still under her gaze and let her look. "Okay," she said finally, "thank you." He made 2 phone calls in the parking lot, in the cold, with his breath making clouds in the night air. The first was to a woman named Carol Briggs, who worked for the county social services office, and whose number he had because she'd come to consult him once about a family that had been living in their car on his property line. He'd found them there and called it in, and Carol had handled it well, humanely, and so he'd kept her number. He told her the situation. She said she would contact the hospital in Callaway that night and find out about the mother and make sure everything was properly documented and that the children were accounted for. She asked his name, and he gave it, and she seemed to recognize it, which meant Carol Briggs was a thorough person who kept good records. The second call was to information, who patched him through to the Harlan's Bluff General Store, who confirmed that yes, they did a monthly delivery to Me Aldridge on Sutter Creek Road And yes, she was still up there as far as they knew because they'd done her delivery just a week ago. He went back inside. He paid Patty for everything, including a generous additional sum that he pressed into her hand with a quiet word. He collected his coat and the children. Sam had fallen asleep against Nora's side again, and Nora had let him, watching over him with an expression of such fierce, tired protectiveness that Elias felt something in his chest do a thing it hadn't done in a very long time. He carried Sam to the truck without asking, because the boy was sleeping and small, and it was cold, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Nora followed. He got them settled in the cab with the heater going. He had a wool blanket behind the seat that he used sometimes when he was working in the cold, and he gave it to Nora, who wrapped it around herself and Sam without self-consciousness, with the pragmatism of someone who had learned to accept warmth when it was offered and ask questions later. The drive to Sutter Creek Road took 40 minutes on roads that were not designed for speed, winding up through dark pine forests with the headlights cutting pale corridors through the black. Nora sat in the middle seat with Sam leaning against her and said nothing for the first stretch, and Elias said nothing either because silence was his natural habitat, and he understood instinctively that this child did not need to be entertained or reassured through the mechanism of constant noise. After about 15 minutes, she said, "Do you live up here?" "About 2 miles below the Sutter Creek turnoff," he said. "Have you always?" "11 years," he said. "Before that I lived in a city, Pittsburgh." She seemed to consider this. "Why'd you leave?" He thought about the honest answer to that question, which involved a marriage that had come apart under the weight of two people who wanted different things, and a corporate job that had been slowly removing something essential from him year by year, and a period of about 4 months where he had felt so fundamentally lost that driving into the mountains one weekend and simply not going back had felt less like a decision and more like a survival instinct. He decided to give her a simpler version. "I needed quiet," he said, "and space, and I wanted to work with my hands." She nodded slowly. "I think I might want that too," she said. "Someday, when everything settles down." He glanced at her sideways. 10 years old, he thought again. "Do you like the woods?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I've never been in them much. We live in Callaway. We lived." She corrected herself quietly, with a small downward shift of her voice that told him she was not sure what tense to use for her life right now, and that she was aware of the uncertainty and was carrying it. "Your mom's going to be all right," Elias said. He would not normally say something like that. He was not a man who made promises about things he couldn't control, because he thought it was dishonest and ultimately unkind. But something about the way Nora had corrected herself, the tiny fracture in her composure, made him say it. And then he added, because he needed to be fair to her, "I don't know that for sure, but Carol, the woman I called, she's going to check on her tonight, and whatever's happening, you're going to know about it. You won't be cut off from it." Nora absorbed this. "Thank you for calling," she said. "I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know who to call." "Now you know," he said. "If you ever need to, Carol Briggs, Harlan's Bluff County Social Services. You can look it up." She said the name once under her breath, committing it to memory. He noticed this and found it, again, remarkable. The Sutter Creek turnoff was marked by a hand-lettered wooden sign that was barely legible in the dark, and the road beyond it was more suggestion than fact, 2 tire tracks through thin scrub, rising steeply along the creek bed. His truck handled it, just barely, the 4-wheel drive earning its keep. He went slowly, and the headlights found their way, and after about a mile of this, the track widened slightly, and there was a house. It was a small house, old, built from logs in the way that people used to build up in these mountains before materials became easier to come by. There was a light in the window. just one, warm and amber, the kind of light that comes from a kerosene lamp rather than an electric bulb. There was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant a fire, which meant someone was home and awake. Elias stopped the truck. He said, "Wait here 1 minute," and got out and went to the door and knocked. The woman who opened it was perhaps 75, small and angular, with white hair cut short and eyes so dark they were nearly black. And the moment he saw those eyes he understood where Nora had gotten hers, the same quality, the same stillness, the same capacity to look at something and take its full measure without flinching. Aldridge looked at him and said nothing. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Elias Cutter. I have your grandchildren in my truck, Nora and Sam. They've had a hard couple of days, and they were trying to get to you." He paused. "They're all right. They're fed and warm, but Sam's asleep, so if you've got a bed for him, that would help." Aldridge put one hand flat against the doorframe, and for a moment he thought she might be about to fall, and he was ready to catch her, but she steadied herself, and the look on her face was not weakness but rather the sudden, overwhelming adjustment of a person receiving news that upends what they thought they knew. She said, in a voice very low and very even, "I didn't know they were coming. My daughter didn't call me. I didn't know. She's in the hospital." Elias said gently, "In Callaway, her heart. I've had someone check on her tonight, and I can get you more information tomorrow when the county office opens." Aldridge closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and stepped back from the door and said, "Bring them in." Elias went back to the truck and opened the cab door. Nora was already awake, sitting up straight, watching the house with those careful eyes. She had seen the lit window, and she had recognized something in it, some quality of warmth or safety, or maybe just the simple fact of a place that was waiting. Sam slept through all of it. Elias lifted him easily, careful not to jostle him, and carried him to the door where Aldridge was waiting. Nora followed, the blanket still around her shoulders. When Nora crossed the threshold, her grandmother took her face in both hands, and they looked at each other, two people with the same dark eyes, the same quality of stillness, and something passed between them that Elias could neither name nor should have tried to, because it belonged to them. He looked away, out into the dark woods, giving them the private second that the moment deserved. Showed him where to put Sam, a small room off the main space, a narrow bed with a heavy quilt, and the boy went down into it without waking, and seemed to sink immediately deeper into the kind of sleep that only children who have finally arrived somewhere safe can manage. Nora sat at Me's kitchen table, and put a kettle on, moving around her small kitchen with the efficiency of a person who knows exactly where everything is, and has never needed it to be anywhere else, and Elias stood near the door because he understood his part in this was nearly done. He told me, briefly and clearly, what he knew: the hospital in Callaway, Carol Briggs at the county office, the truck broken down on the mountain road that someone would need to retrieve or deal with. Listened and asked 2 practical questions and nodded at the answers. She was not a woman who was overwhelmed by information. She processed it and stored it and would act on it in the morning. "I'll drive down to Callaway myself tomorrow," she said. "I've got a neighbor with a truck who'll take me." She looked at Elias steadily. "I owe you something considerable, Mr. Cutter." "You don't," he said. "I just did what was in front of me to do." Aldridge looked at him for a moment in the same way her granddaughter had looked at him in the diner, taking him apart a little, reading the components. "Most people don't," she said simply. He said his good nights. He got as far as the door before Nora said his name. He turned. She was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of something had made her, and she was looking at him with those old eyes, and in them now was something different from what had been there at the diner. The armor was down, just slightly, just enough. There was something in her face that he recognized as trust, the cautious, hard, one kind that means more than the easy kind, the kind that has been tested against hard experience and survived. "Thank you," she said, for not giving us directions and leaving, for actually coming." He held her gaze. "You're welcome, Nora," he said. He drove home through the dark mountains with the heater running and his 3 dogs waiting for him at the cabin door. And he fed them and built up the fire and sat in his chair and did not read or listen to the radio or do any of the things he usually did in the evenings. He sat and looked at the fire, and he thought about a 10-year-old girl asking strangers for leftovers with the steady, unsentimental pragmatism of someone who has decided that survival is more important than dignity, and about what that kind of composure costs a person over time, and about those dark, ancient eyes that had looked at him and seen, somehow, that he was someone worth trusting. He was not a man who cried easily or often. He could not remember the last time he had. But sitting there in the firelight with Bear's head on his knee, and Marcy stretched out on the hearth and Ghost lying against the door as he always did, he felt something in him shift and settle. The way a heavy thing settles when it's been set down after a long carry, and his eyes got wet and he let them, because there was no one to see, and it seemed necessary, and he did not believe in pretending things weren't necessary when they clearly were. The next morning he called Carol Briggs before 7. She had good news. The mother, her name was Diane Aldridge, she'd kept her maiden name, was stable. The cardiac situation was serious but manageable. She would likely be in the hospital for another 3 to 4 weeks, but the prognosis was cautiously positive. Carol had confirmed with the hospital that Nora and Sam were with their grandmother and that this was an appropriate and safe placement, and she had opened a file and would be checking in. She spoke with the careful, thorough competence that he had noted the previous night, and he thanked her and meant it. He drove up to meet Aldridge's house that morning with 2 things: a cord of firewood that he split and stacked himself in her side yard because her own supply was running low, and a box of food from his pantry, preserves and canned goods and a bag of flour and a wheel of hard cheese and a smoked ham that he'd done himself the previous fall, because he could see that feeding 2 unexpected children through a mountain winter on an old woman's fixed resources would be a strain. Me watched him unload the truck from the doorway and did not protest, which told him she was a wise woman who understood the difference between pride and practicality. She invited him in for coffee when he was done. The children were both awake. Sam had apparently slept for 11 hours straight and woken up, according to Me's dry report, entirely cheerful and primarily interested in whether there was a dog somewhere on the property. There was not, but Me had told him there were sometimes foxes near the creek, and Sam had accepted this as a reasonable substitute and taken himself off to look out the back window in focused anticipation. Nora was helping Me in the kitchen, drying dishes. She looked different in the morning light of a house where she was safe, still serious, still watchful, but with some of the compression gone, as if she had had room overnight to expand back in her actual size. She was, he realized, a remarkably self-possessed child, the kind who asks interesting questions and listens to the answers with genuine attention, and who will, someday, be a remarkable adult. She asked him about his lumber operation. He told her about it, about the managed forestry, about the way he replanted and thinned and worked with the land's own rhythms rather than against them. She listened with those attentive eyes and asked, at the end, whether it was possible to learn how to do that. He said it was. He said it took time and patience and willingness to learn from your mistakes. She nodded as if she was storing this away. He visited 3 more times over the following weeks, always with some practical excuse: more wood. Help with a repair on Me's roof that he noticed needed attention. A bag of seed potatoes, he said he had too many of, which was arguably true. Me accepted each visit with the same dignified equanimity, made coffee, and allowed things to be what they were without requiring them to be labeled. She was a woman who understood that some men do kindness obliquely, through the vehicle of practical tasks, because it's the only channel wide enough to carry the feeling. Sam attached himself to Elias with the uncomplicated devotion of a 6-year-old boy who likes large quiet men and has a strong interest in working trucks and animals. He wanted to see the dogs. Elias brought the dogs on his 4th visit, and Sam spent an ecstatic 40 minutes in the yard with Bear, Ghost, and Marcy, and this became a standing request. Elias found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not mind bringing them, that he looked forward to the drive up the creek road, which he had previously only seen as a track on a map. Their mother, Diane, came home, not home to Callaway, but home to Me's house, in late November, thinner and more fragile than she had apparently been before, but alive and recovering. Elias met her on a Sunday afternoon, a woman with Nora's cheekbones and Sam's openness, who took his hand when they were introduced and held it for a moment and said, simply, "You brought my kids here," and he said, "They mostly brought themselves," which was close enough to true. By December, the 4 of them were settled into Me's small house, with the particular compressed warmth of people who have discovered that they fit together better than the space might suggest. Diane was getting stronger. Sam had decided the foxes by the creek were his own personal foxes and had named 2 of them. Nora had found a stack of old books in Me's back room and was working through them with the systematic determination of a person who treats reading as a serious project, which it apparently was for her. Elias came for dinner on the 2nd Saturday of December, because Me had asked him in the direct, no-ceremony way she had of doing things, and because he had understood, over the preceding weeks, that declining this particular invitation would be foolish. He brought wine, because he knew Me kept a small amount of it for occasions, and he brought a jar of his own honey, and he brought Ghost because Sam was going to ask about the dogs anyway. They ate around Me's table, the 4 of them and Elias, and it was loud in a way his life almost never was, with Sam conducting a detailed monologue about the foxes, and Diane asking Elias questions about managed forestry with a genuine interest that surprised and pleased him, and Me maintaining her quiet, gravitational presence at the head of the table, the fixed point around which everything else oriented. After dinner, after Sam had been put to bed, and Diane had taken a cup of tea to her room to rest, because she still tired easily, Elias sat with Me and Nora at the cleared table with the kerosene lamp lit against the deep December dark. Nora was reading. Me was working on something with her hands, a piece of mending, and Elias had his hands around a mug of coffee and was looking at nothing in particular, and the silence between the 3 of them was comfortable in the way that silence only gets between people who have earned it together. Nora looked up from her book. She looked at him with those dark eyes, a little warmer now than they had been that first night, still serious, still ancient in their understanding, but with a quality in them that had not been there in the diner, something that he thought, carefully, was peace. Not the peace of problems solved, because her problems were not all solved and wouldn't be for a long time, but the peace of being in the right place, for now, with the right people, which is as much as any of us can manage on any given winter night. "Elias," she said. "Nora," he said. "Why do you come up here so much?" she asked. "You don't have to." He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. He thought about 11 years of being alone on 40 acres of mountain and finding it, until very recently, entirely sufficient. He thought about the drive up the Sutter Creek Road that he now took without the excuse of firewood or roof repairs, just because his truck seemed to know the way. He thought about a bowl of stew and a coffee he'd picked up and carried around a wooden partition, and what had come after. "I find I don't want to not come," he said, which was, as far as he could tell, the truth, and also probably as close as he was going to get to saying it more plainly than that. Nora considered this for a moment. Then she nodded, with the gravity of a person who has understood something precisely, and went back to her book. Me, who had been listening, said nothing at all. She just kept mending in the lamplight, in the warm and solid dark of her house on the mountain, and the fire crackled, and somewhere below the window the creek ran over its stones the way it had been running for 1,000 years, patient and unceasing, finding its way down through rock and root, the way water does, the way most things that persist eventually do, not by force, but by the steady accumulation of small, reliable, daily effort. Elias finished his coffee. He stayed another hour, until the lamp was turned low and me was yawning in the dignified way she yawned, which suggested sleep was imminent and guests should be aware. He put on his coat. He collected Ghost from the hearth where the dog had been sleeping. He said his good nights. He drove home through the winter dark, and when he got there he let all 3 dogs in against the cold, which he did not always do but found himself doing more often lately. He built up the fire and sat in his chair and did not feel the specific quiet of a man who is alone, which was the quiet he had sat in for 11 years and which had seemed, until very recently, entirely adequate. He felt instead the quiet of a man who knows where he's going tomorrow and the day after, and who has discovered, later than most but not too late, that the 40 acres he thought were sufficient were perhaps the beginning of a larger map, and that sometimes a child's eyes, seen across a diner booth on a cold October night, can redraw everything you thought you knew about what your life is. For he had walked into a diner for stew. He had heard 4 words, "May we have your leftovers," and he had stood up, and he had gone around the partition, and his life had shifted on its axis, quietly, without announcement, the way the most important things usually do. He sat with the fire and his dogs, and he was, without quite having a word for it yet, glad.